Bloodborne has a lot of content that never made it to the final game, and what did make it through is stranger than most players ever realise. So today, we are going to go through some of the rarest, most overlooked, and most misunderstood anomalies buried inside this game. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to be upfront about something. I made this video because Bloodborne keeps giving. I have spent more hours in this game than I am willing to admit publicly, and there are still corners of it that genuinely surprised me when I was doing research for this. The choice I made when assembling this video was to focus on things that are either mechanically verifiable, grounded in data mining, or backed up by NPC dialogue and item descriptions rather than popular fan theories that have been repeated so many times they feel like facts. Some of what I present here is interpretation. I will tell you when that is the case. This is my reading of the evidence, not the final word. Chapter 1. The Orphan of Kos and the Signals. Nobody talks about. The Orphan of Kos is one of the most famous bosses in the game, and yet the community has largely overlooked a handful of things about this encounter that are genuinely strange. Most players remember the screaming, the placenta weapon, and the second phase transformation. What they do not talk about as much is the timing of certain audio cues in this fight that do not appear to line up with the animations they are paired with. There is a scream that fires in the boss arena under very specific circumstances that has no visible source and does not correspond to any animation the orphan is performing at that moment. Researchers who have gone through the audio files have found that this particular sound belongs to a different entity entirely. The scream in question is labelled internally in a way that suggests it belongs to Kos herself, not the orphan, Kos, the beached god who is already dead when you arrive on the fishing hamlet shore. This is interesting because the game never gives you a direct moment where Kos speaks or reacts to anything. She is simply there, enormous, rotting and silent. But the data suggests that at some point in development, she was meant to have a more active presence in the fight. Whether that means she was going to animate, vocalize more deliberately, or participate in some scripted event that was cut is not something we can confirm, but the label is there. When you actually listen to the scream isolated from the rest of the fight music and ambient audio, there is a quality to it that is different from the orphan's vocalizations. The orphan has a layered, almost mechanical distortion on top of its voice. This scream is cleaner, lower in some frequencies, and has a kind of resonance to it that most of the other sounds in the area do not share. The fishing hamlet has this wet, oppressive sound design throughout, and this particular audio clip sits in a slightly different sonic space than everything around it. Players who have tested this have noted that the trigger for the scream seems to be tied to a specific health threshold on the orphan, not a particular attack or phase transition. Around 60% health, if you're standing in a particular region of the arena, the sound will sometimes fire. It does not always fire. The inconsistency itself is interesting, because it suggests this might be a remnant of a more complex event trigger system that was simplified during development. Something was supposed to happen at that health threshold, and what remains is a ghost of that plan. Now, none of this means Kos was going to be a second boss phase, or that there was a two-stage encounter in the original design. That interpretation goes further than the evidence supports. What it does suggest is that the relationship between Kos and the orphan during the fight was more dynamic at some point. The orphan acts like a child defending a parent, and perhaps that was going to be reflected more explicitly in the encounter design, rather than just thematically. The fishing hamlet itself has a number of audio anomalies that are worth examining before we move further into the fight data. The ambient ocean sounds in this area include several low-frequency pulses that cycle at irregular intervals. Most players hear this as just background noise, but when you isolate the ambient audio track and slow it down, The pulses have a structure to them. They are not random. They repeat in a pattern that cycles roughly every 4 minutes. And within that cycle, there are 3 distinct pulse signatures that are different from each other in ways that seem deliberate. Some researchers have suggested this ambient audio is actually a very slow, very low version of a musical motif that appears in compressed form in other parts of the game's soundtrack. The correlation is not perfect, but it is close enough that it has been taken seriously by people who know the game's audio design well. If this is accurate, it would mean the environment itself is playing a kind of music, just at a frequency and tempo that humans experience as ambient sound rather than melody. The fishing hamlet villagers are another point of interest that connects to the Kos encounter. These enemies are humanoid, but clearly altered in ways that go beyond standard Bloodborne transformation. Most enemies in the game who have become beast-like have a readable logic to their transformation. The villagers of the fishing hamlet have scales. They have features that reference aquatic life in ways that the beast transformation framework does not normally produce. This suggests they were not transformed by contact with the beast plague, but by something else entirely. Item descriptions in the area point toward a history of communion with Kos and the fishing hamlet inhabitants. The Kos parasite's description is particularly direct about this, noting that Kos passed her knowledge to her kin on her death. The villagers are likely what remained of that process after generations of contact with a Great One. But the exact mechanism of their transformation, whether it was intentional, gradual, or something more like an infection, is left ambiguous. The data does not resolve this cleanly. What is notable is that the villagers in the hamlet are not hostile to the orphan during the fight. They will attempt to attack the player and ignore the orphan entirely, even when the orphan's attacks hit nearby. This is usually explained away as simple AI behavior, but the specificity of it is worth noting. They are not just ignoring the orphan as a neutral entity. They are protecting the arena. They behave more like acolytes protecting a ritual space than like creatures simply doing damage to nearby targets. The orphan's weapon, the detached placenta, has physics behavior in its first phase that is not fully explained by the game's standard ragdoll and collision systems. The placenta swings and drags in ways that sometimes clip through terrain in the arena in a specific location near the tide line. This is a known bug, but the interesting part is that the collision mesh in that area has a gap that does not appear to be accidental. Other gaps in the arena's collision mesh are clearly incidental, the result of complex geometry not being perfectly sealed. This one is in a flat, simple part of the terrain where there is no obvious geometric reason for it to exist. One possible reading is that this gap was left from an earlier version of the arena where the tide line was in a different position, or where a second interactable element existed near the water. The fishing hamlet has evidence throughout the shore being more traversable in earlier builds. The terrain at the water's edge is more detailed than you ever need to actually engage with during normal gameplay, and there are texture seams in that area that suggest something used to connect to it. The orphan's second phase is triggered when its health drops below 50%, at which point it loses the placenta, sprouts feathered wings, and gains several new attacks. The transition animation is one of the most elaborate in the game, and hidden within it is a brief moment where the orphan appears to look directly at the camera. Not at the player character, at the camera. This is extremely difficult to catch in real time because the transition is fast and the camera is typically in motion, but frame-by-frame analysis confirms it. The head turns to face the lens of the game's virtual camera for approximately 3 frames. This kind of behavior in a game character is sometimes called breaking the fourth wall, and in most games it would be either a mistake or a deliberate stylistic choice. In Bloodborne's context, given the game's themes around insight, the act of seeing things beyond the veil of the physical world, and the relationship between the player and the hunter, this moment takes on a different quality. Whether it was intentional is genuinely unclear. The people who made this game are known for hiding detail in unusual places. The orphan's cries during the second phase change in pitch and character as the fight goes on. In the earliest seconds of the second phase, the vocalizations are closer to what you might describe as grief. They are high, strained, and irregular. As the fight continues and the orphan sustains more damage, the vocalizations shift towards something that sounds more like rage. This is not just tonal variety for variety's sake. The shift follows a consistent pattern that maps to specific health thresholds, meaning the emotional register of the creature's voice was deliberately scripted to change as the fight progresses. By the time the orphan is near death, its vocalizations include a low register that was not present in the first phase at all. This frequency was not accessible to the voice actor or creature designer through normal means and was instead created through audio processing. The decision to layer that particular frequency into the dying cries of the orphan was a specific production choice, and it gives the sound a quality that most people describe as wrong, in a way they cannot quite identify. The death animation of the orphan is another area of interest. When the orphan dies, it collapses, and there is a brief moment where the wings appear to partially retract before the body goes still. This retraction is incomplete and happens very quickly, but if you slow the footage down, it is clearly a deliberate animation rather than a physics collapse. The wings do not fall randomly. They fold in toward the body in a specific pattern that mirrors the way the orphan holds them when it is idle in the second phase. This suggests the death animation was designed to show a moment of release rather than simply defeat. The lighting in the orphan arena changes in a way that most players do not consciously register. The fight takes place near sunset or dusk, and as the fight progresses, the ambient light level shifts. This is part of the game's real-time sky system rather than a scripted event. But the timing of the transition means that by the time a player reaches the second phase of a typical fight, the arena is noticeably darker than it was when the fight began. This is not an accident. The art direction around this encounter was built around the fight taking place across that specific window of light. When you kill the orphan and the dream cuts in with the Great One's wisdom reward, there is a sound in the room transition that most players miss because they are looking at the reward. It is very faint and very brief, but it is the same low-frequency pulse that appears in the Fishing Hamlet ambient audio. One pulse, and then nothing. This small detail is the kind of thing that the development team buried deliberately, something you would only catch after many runs, and even then, only if you knew to listen for it. The Ko's parasite, the weapon you receive from her remains before fighting the orphan, has an alternate moveset that requires the empty phantasm shell to access its full range. This relationship between the parasite and the shell is interesting because the shell itself is described as a relic left behind by a Great One. The parasite was left by Kos. Both are remains of entities connected to the arcane. The fact that the shell activates the parasite's secondary behavior suggests a kind of compatibility that goes beyond simple game mechanics. Several players have noted that the parasite's transformed mode attacks seem to have an extended hitbox range that does not match their visual appearance. The tendrils extend visually to a certain point, but the actual damage zone reaches slightly further. This is a common enough quirk in action games, but the specific degree of mismatch in the parasite's case is larger than for most weapons in the game. Whether this was a balancing decision or an artifact of how the hitbox system handles the unusual geometry of a living weapon is unknown. The parasite also has an unusual behavior when used in the Hunter's Nightmare outside of the boss arena. In this area, which is the accessible part of the DLC, before you reach the Fishing Hamlet, the parasite's moveset behaves identically to how it does elsewhere. But if you bring it into specific parts of the nightmare, near certain environmental triggers, some players have reported the weapon's audio behaving differently. The ambient sound mix appears to react to the parasite's presence in a way it does not react to other weapons. This has not been definitively confirmed through data mining, but has been reproduced by multiple players under the same conditions. The Hunter's Nightmare, as a whole, is worth spending some time on before we move further. The nightmare is the physical reflection of the original Yharnam of the old Hunter's era, twisted and looping in a way consistent with how the game describes the nightmares of great ones. The layout of the nightmare shares structural similarity with the main game's Yharnam streets, but is distorted in scale and placement in ways that suggest it is a memory of that space rather than a copy. Doors are in slightly wrong positions. Streets are too narrow or too wide. The sky's the wrong colour at the wrong time. If you map the nightmare's layout against the main game's Yharnam Cathedral ward, certain connections become apparent. The flow of the areas matches at a macro level, meaning the sequence of spaces you move through follows the same logic, even if the individual rooms are different. This suggests the nightmare is using the old hunter's memories of that part of the city as its foundation. The great ones who construct these spaces do not create from nothing. They construct from what the minds they trap already contain. Ludwig's fog gate in the nightmare has an unusual property that was discovered fairly recently. The normal behaviour of fog gates in Bloodborne is that they are transparent when approached and become opaque as you pass through them. Ludwig's fog gate does not fully become opaque. If you stand at certain angles relative to the gate after passing through, you can see a partial transparency where the gate's material is rendering incorrectly. Through this transparency, the geometry of the area you came from is visible, which is standard, but occasionally a model that does not belong to that area appears briefly in that space before the rendering corrects itself. This model is partially obscured and only visible for a frame or two in the right conditions, but players who have caught it and examined screenshots describe it as a large humanoid figure in a posture that does not match any enemy in the game. Some have suggested it is a remnant mesh from an earlier version of the area. Others have noted that its silhouette is unusual enough that it might be from a cut enemy type. Without access to the original development files, this cannot be resolved definitively. Ludwig himself is one of the most data-rich bosses in the game in terms of cut content and residual behaviour. His first phase has animations that are used in the fight, and several that are not. There are attack wind-up animations in his file that do not correspond to any move he currently performs in the game. They are complete animations with full follow-through, not half-finished drafts. They were removed from the behaviour tree at some point after completion, which means they were finalised and then cut. One of these unused animations appears to be a grapple attack, where Ludwig grabs the player character. Bloodborne has very few grab attacks compared to the Souls games, and this one being cut from Ludwig specifically is interesting given how well a grab would suit his first phase design. The animation exists, it is complete, and the hitbox data associated with it is still present in the game files, even though it is never triggered. Ludwig's second phase, the lucid phase where he partially regains his humanity, has dialogue that is read from a text file during the encounter. The amount of text in that file is longer than what is actually voiced in the game. There are lines in the text string for Ludwig's dialogue that were either cut from the voice recording session or recorded and then removed from the final mix. These lines are not full sentences in all cases, but the fragments that are there suggest the second phase conversation was meant to be longer and possibly more interactive. Ludwig's helmet, the item you receive after the encounter, has a description that references his transformation in the context of a specific place called the Powder Kegs' workshop. The Powder Kegs are a hunter faction that has very little presence in the main game, but a significantly larger presence in the background lore accessible through item descriptions. The connection between Ludwig and this faction is established in the helmet's text, but the game never pays it off in dialogue or in an accessible physical location tied to the faction. The Powder Kegs workshop, if it exists anywhere in the game's geography, would logically be somewhere in the nightmare, given that the nightmare is built from memories of old Yharnam. Several architectural elements in the nightmare's later sections have visual features that match the aesthetic described in items associated with the powder kegs. Certain mechanical and structural details on walls and in certain rooms reference a style of construction that powder keg items describe. Whether this is intentional set dressing or coincidence is a reading each viewer will have to make for themselves. Maria's tower in the nightmare, which leads to the clock tower boss arena, has a number of environmental details that support the idea that she was a resident of that space rather than simply a guardian placed there. Personal items and furniture arrangements in the tower suggest occupancy over a long period. The music box that plays during her fight is a version of a melody associated with her mentor, Yharnam, and the choice to use that particular melody during this encounter was clearly deliberate. Lady Maria's fight itself has a famous anomaly that longtime players know, but newcomers sometimes discover as a surprise. If you stand completely still and do not attack her for an extended period at the start of the fight, she will perform a specific idle animation that she does not perform under any other circumstances. She sheathes her blade and appears to wait. This behavior does not last indefinitely and eventually snaps back into her attack pattern, but the window is long enough to observe clearly. No other boss in the game has this property. The behavior suggests that at some point in development, there was a non-combat interaction planned with Maria that allowed the player to approach without triggering immediate hostility. Whether this was a full dialogue sequence or simply an extended observation window is unknown. But the fact that the idle animation is complete and properly integrated into her behavior tree, rather than being a leftover artifact, suggests it was considered seriously enough to implement properly. Maria's blood attacks in her second and third phases have a visual property that changes depending on the player's arcane stat. This is not widely known because most players who fight her multiple times do not vary their builds significantly. But players who have tested this confirm that at higher arcane values, the blood projectiles in her attacks appear slightly larger and have an additional particle effect. The damage value does not change, only the visual. This suggests there was at one point a more complex interaction planned between the player's arcane level and how they perceive the boss's attacks. Chapter 2: The Murgo's Wet Nurse and What the Data Suggests. About the missing child. Murgo's Wet Nurse is the final boss of the main game's nightmare sequence, and the anomalies surrounding her encounter go well beyond the famous question of where Murgo actually is. Most discussion of this boss centers on the lore interpretation of whether the crying you hear is Murgo, whether Murgo is present in any physical form, and what the wet nurse actually is in relation to the child she protects. These are all valid questions, but they are not the anomalies I want to focus on here. The arena for the wet nurse fight has a sky that is unlike any other sky in the game. Bloodborne uses several sky variants, each associated with specific areas and the emotional register of those spaces. The sky in the wet nurse arena is a dark, starless void with a specific gradient on the horizon that does not appear in any other location. When you extract the sky texture for this arena and compare it to all other sky textures in the game, this one has additional detail in a frequency range that is not visible to the naked eye during normal play, but is present in the raw texture data. Players who have converted this texture data to visible spectrum equivalents describe the detail as resembling a very faint, very regular pattern of lines. The lines form a grid-like structure that covers the entire sky texture. The structure is too regular to be noise and too faint to be intentional visual design. One interpretation is that this is an artifact of a procedural generation process used to create the texture, a kind of mathematical fingerprint left by the tool that was used to make it. Another interpretation, and this is the one that lore readers find more interesting, is that it is intentional and represents the structure of the dream itself, made visible in the one arena that exists deepest within the nightmare layer. The wet nurse herself has a model detail that most players never see because of how the fight is staged. Her multiple arms are clearly the defining visual feature of the encounter, and the camera tends to be occupied with avoiding her attacks. But if you pause at the moment she spreads her wings and look at the center of her silhouette, there is a shape visible within the darkness of her form that is not present in any of her promotional artwork or in any official illustration. It appears to be a small featureless humanoid shape, visible only in the darkest region of her shadow. This detail is extremely easy to dismiss as a rendering artifact, and that is probably what most people do when they encounter it. The darkness in that region of her model is dense enough that any shape within it is ambiguous. But players who have looked at this from multiple angles during the fight and in environments with modified brightness settings report that the shape maintains its form from different viewing positions, which is the behavior of a deliberate piece of geometry rather than a shadow artifact. If that geometry is real, the obvious reading is that it represents Murgo, the child that the wet nurse is protecting. The game never shows you Murgo directly, and the entire emotional weight of the encounter rests on the sound of an infant crying in a space that appears to contain nothing. The idea that Murgo is literally inside the wet nurse, visible only as a shadow within her shadow, would be consistent with the game's approach to hiding its most important elements in plain sight. The crying audio used in the Murgo fight has been analysed in significant detail by people with audio engineering backgrounds. The cry is not a recording of a real infant. It was constructed from multiple layered samples that each contribute different qualities to the final sound. Some of these samples are identifiably human in the range of infant vocalizations, but at least two of the layers are not human in origin. One is an animal vocalization that has been significantly pitch shifted. The other is a purely synthetic tone generated at a specific frequency. The synthetic tone in the crying audio sits at a frequency that is associated with unease in audio psychology research. This is not a conspiracy or a stretch. The specific frequency range in question has been studied in the context of horror media audio design and is known to produce low-level anxiety responses in listeners even when they cannot consciously identify the source of their discomfort. Its presence in the Murgo cry audio was almost certainly a deliberate design choice by the sound team. When Murgo's wet nurse is killed, the cry stops immediately. Not gradually, not with a fade. It cuts off with a hard stop. The silence that follows is one of the most commented on moments in the game's community, and for good reason. That silence is architecturally important to the emotional experience of the ending. But the technical implementation of that silence is also interesting. The game's audio engine continues to generate ambient noise throughout the fight. The wind sound, the low hum of the nightmare space, all of it continues after the wet nurse falls. Only the cry stops. This required the cry to be on its own dedicated audio channel rather than blended into the ambient mix, which is the standard approach for most environmental sounds. The wet nurse's dodge behaviour is one of the most unusual in the game from a mechanical standpoint. She teleports rather than dodging in a conventional sense, and the teleport has a very brief delay between the visual vanish and the repositioning. During this delay, her hitbox is still present at the original location. Several players have discovered that attacks timed to this delay window will register damage even though the model is no longer visible. This behaviour is either an artifact of how the teleport was implemented or a very subtle mechanical design choice that rewards players who understand the timing. The arena has an environmental feature that most players never interact with because there is no obvious reason to approach it during the fight. At the very edge of the arena, near the circular boundary that transitions from walkable floor to the void, there is a slight variation in the floor texture. If you examine this texture variation closely in a situation where you're not being attacked, you can see that it forms a pattern. The pattern is not decorative in the way that most floor textures in the game are decorative. It is more like a marking, reminiscent of the ritual circles you see in other parts of the game associated with arcane practices. This particular marking does not appear in any other context and does not match any of the ritual circle designs used elsewhere. Its purpose, if it has one, is unknown. One reading is that it marks the centre of whatever ritual or event placed Murgo in the nightmare in the first place. Another reading is that it is simply a texture detail that was added to make the floor look more intentional and was never meant to carry narrative weight. Yharnam's connection to the Murgo encounter is worth discussing because it is suggested by several converging pieces of evidence rather than stated directly. Yharnam created the doll. The doll exists in the hunter's dream. The hunter's dream exists as a buffer zone between the waking world and the nightmares. The nightmares were created by Great Ones and are sustained by their presence and suffering. Murgo is a Great One's child, or a partial Great One, or something in the vicinity of that classification, and the nightmare you travel through to reach her fight is named for her. The connection between Yharnam's role as the caretaker of the dream and Murgo's role as the reason the nightmare exists is left implicit by the game. But the structure of the lore suggests that killing Murgo and ending her crying is what allows Yharnam's dream to reach its conclusion. The order of events matters here. You must go through the nightmare to reach Murgo. You must end Murgo's crying to trigger the ending sequence. And that ending sequence centres on Yharnam and the moon presence, rather than on anything directly related to Murgo. The wet nurse has an unusual colour temperature in her environment that shifts during the fight. This is very subtle and requires a calibrated display to notice, but the dominant colour of the arena's ambient light changes toward a cooler hue as the fight progresses. This was likely implemented as a psychological pressure tool to increase the feeling of isolation and cold as the encounter becomes more intense. But the specific gradient of the shift corresponds to no other lighting transition in the game, making it a unique visual programming choice for this encounter. When you obtain the third umbilical cord piece from Murgo, completing the collection necessary for the true ending, the game plays a sound effect that is technically the same sound used for obtaining any other umbilical cord piece. But the mix on this instance of the sound is different from the other two. The reverb tail is longer, and there is an additional layer underneath it that is not present in the other chord pickup sounds. This suggests either a deliberate audio design choice to make the final chord feel different, or a mixing error that was never caught. Given the attention to detail in the rest of this game, the deliberate interpretation seems more likely. The hunter's nightmare's relationship to Murgo's nightmare is not clearly geographic in the way that the main game's areas are related to each other. The DLC's nightmare and the main game's nightmare are presented as separate spaces, but both are characterized as nightmares, sustained by the suffering of Great Ones. The old hunters are trapped in their nightmare because of what they did to Koz and her kin. Murgo's nightmare exists because of whatever happened to Murgo. These are different traumas, producing similar structures. The wet nurse's wings have a secondary animation layer that activates when she's not actively attacking. In the idle and repositioning states, her wings move in a slow rhythmic pattern that does not match a flight pattern or a threat display. The movement is closer to breathing. This was a deliberate animation decision that adds to the sense that the wet nurse is a creature that exists in a biological relationship with Murgo, not simply a guardian figure. Her wing design itself is borrowed from a specific real-world source in a way that most people do not catch. The feathering pattern on her wings closely matches the wing structure of barn owls rather than the more generic bird wings used in fantasy design. Barn owls are associated in various cultural traditions with death, transition, and the guarding of boundaries between the living world and whatever is on the other side. This choice of reference was almost certainly intentional, given the wet nurse's role as the guardian of a space between life and some other state of existence. The nightmare. Apostle enemies in Murgo's area have a behaviour that is unique among enemy types in the game. If you stand completely still for approximately 30 seconds in their aggro range, they will pause their attack patterns and perform an idle animation that includes a vocalization. This vocalization is not used anywhere else in the game by these enemies. It only triggers under this specific condition, and it is quiet enough that most players who encounter it assume it is part of the ambient audio. When this vocalization is isolated and examined, it has been described by audio researchers as being in the same general frequency range as the Murgo crying sound. Not identical, not a match, but in the same register. This could be coincidence, or it could be suggesting that the apostles are in some kind of resonance with Murgo, that their behaviour is shaped by proximity to whatever Murgo is. The path to Murgo's wet nurse requires passing through Yharnam and then through the lecture building, which is a transitional space that does not physically connect to either area in any conventional geographic sense. The lecture building is one of the game's most explicitly weird spaces in terms of how it is explained within the game's world. Students are trapped there. Amygdalas are present on the walls. The slide lectures on the walls reference Great One Communion. But the building's role as a connector between Yharnam and the nightmare is never explained. You take an elevator in one area and emerge in a completely different physical reality. The lecture building serves as the hinge point for this transition, and several environmental details in the building suggest it was designed specifically for this purpose, as a controlled point of transit between the waking world and the nightmare layer. The elevator in Yharnam that leads to the lecture building has a sound design detail that many players miss because they are focused on managing the enemies in the area. The elevator has a distinct sound effect as it descends, but if you turn off the music in the area's audio mix and listen only to the environment, the elevator's mechanical sound is layered with a very quiet second sound that begins midway through the descent and crescendos as you arrive at the bottom. This second sound is not part of the elevator's audio asset. It is part of the ambient audio of the destination space, starting to bleed into the elevator's sound space before the transition is complete. This is a sound design technique called preemptive audio bleed, and it is used to psychologically prepare the listener for the acoustic environment they are about to enter. The fact that this technique was applied to the transition into the lecture building suggests the designers considered this transition to be one of the more important sensory thresholds in the game, enough to spend the additional audio design work on making the crossing feel substantial. Murgo's Lullaby, the piece of music that plays in the wet nurse's arena, has a structure that rewards close listening. The main melody is well known. But underneath the main melody, there is a counter melody that is easier to hear in the quieter passages between the fight's more intense moments. This counter melody is in a different time signature than the main melody, creating a polyrhythmic structure that gives the piece its unsettling, dreamlike quality. The choice to write the music this way, rather than using a simpler unifying rhythm, was a deliberate compositional decision that makes the piece feel fundamentally unstable. The crying is mixed into this piece as an element of the soundtrack, rather than as a purely diegetic sound. In most games, a sound coming from within the game world would be presented as a realistic spatial sound that gets louder and softer depending on your position relative to its source. The Murgo cry does not behave this way. It maintains a consistent presence in the audio mix, regardless of where you are in the arena. It is everywhere and nowhere, which is consistent with the game's suggestion that Murgo is present but not physically locatable. Chapter 3. Cut bosses, phantom trigger boxes, and the test areas left behind in the code. From the very beginning of Bloodborne's modding and data mining history, researchers have found evidence of content that did not make it into the final game. The presence of cut content is not unusual for a major production. What is unusual about Bloodborne is the degree to which that cut content is preserved in readable states and the implications of what some of it suggests about the game's original scope. The most famous cut boss is the Dark Beast Parl variant that exists in the data but is never encountered in normal gameplay. This variant is larger than the Parl you fight in Yharnam, and it has a different lightning density in its coat, suggesting it was further along in the beast transformation that Parl represents. The behaviour tree for this variant is complete and functional. It responds to player input. It has an aggro state, a patrol state, and a death state. Every system that a shipped boss needs is there and working. It was simply removed from the world before launch. The size difference between the cut variant and the shipped Parl is significant enough that placing this variant in the Yharnam arena without modification would result in clipping through the ceiling and walls. Either the variant was designed for a different arena that was also cut, or there was a plan to build a larger space specifically for this encounter that was abandoned before the arena was completed. The existing Parl arena shows no signs of having been scaled down from a larger design. There is also a cleric beast variant in the data that has a health pool and stat scaling pattern, consistent with a late game encounter rather than an early game one. The cleric beast you fight on the bridge in central Yharnam is one of the first bosses most players encounter, and its difficulty and stats are calibrated accordingly. The variant in the data has the same model, but with stats that would place it in difficulty alongside late-game bosses in Yharnam or the Nightmare of Mensis. This suggests it was intended to appear again later in the game, possibly in a different location. Several NPCs in the game reference events and encounters that do not correspond to anything in the final game. Eileen the Crow mentions a specific hunter whose whereabouts she is tracking during the early game, and if you follow her questline to its conclusion, some aspects of that hunter's story are resolved. But details in her dialogue point toward a longer arc that was truncated. The conclusions she reaches in the shipped questline do not feel like they account for all of the information she provides earlier. The trigger box system in Bloodborne is used to control area transitions, boss fog gates, NPC activation, and environmental events. The game world contains a number of trigger boxes that no longer have active functions. They exist in the collision and event data. They fire when the player enters them, but the events they are connected to have been removed or changed. These phantom triggers are usually harmless, but some of them produce visible reactions in the game world. One example is in the Forbidden Woods. There is a tree formation near the area's river section that has a trigger box around it. When the player enters this trigger, nothing happens visibly, but if you have a listener on the game's event system during this moment, you can detect that an audio call is being made to a file that no longer exists in the shipped game. The call fails silently, but the attempt to make it proves that something was meant to happen in that location and was removed after the trigger was already placed. The Cathedral Ward has a similar phantom trigger near the staircase that leads up toward Vicar Amelia's fog gate. This one is connected to a script that appears to be designed to spawn an NPC at that location under specific conditions. The spawn conditions include checking for a variable that is never set to the required value in the shipped game, meaning the NPC will never actually appear, but the NPC it would spawn has a model and behaviour tree in the data. It is a hooded figure with no defined hostility state, which would classify it as a non-combatant NPC rather than an enemy. The Healing Church Workshop, the area reached through the Cathedral Ward, has phantom trigger geometry, suggesting the space was originally intended to be more traversable. The workshop is largely a linear descent to a specific item, and then a dead end. But the trigger geometry includes event zones on walls that face toward exterior surfaces, suggesting those walls were once exterior surfaces that face toward additional space. The workshop may have been designed as a more expansive area with access to adjacent sections of the cathedral structure that were sealed off or cut during development. The abandoned old workshop, the secret area deep below the cathedral ward, has no phantom triggers visible in the event data, but its placement in the world is itself an anomaly. Reaching it requires taking a fall from the main cathedral ward path that the game never signals in any way. No item description, no NPC dialogue, no visible landmark points toward this area's existence. The way players discovered it initially was through accidental falls and through data mining that revealed a walkable space below the main path. The question of how players were expected to find it without any signposting has never been answered satisfactorily. The abandoned workshop contains the doll's set in a wearable state and a dead version of the doll. The connection between this space and Gehrman's history is clear from context, but the lack of any signposting remains strange. If the game wanted players to find this, there should be some breadcrumb leading them there. The current setup allows for the interpretation that the game does not expect players to find it organically, and it was designed as a discovery for people who specifically went looking. The Cleric Beast's audio has a phantom track in the game's audio files that is labelled as belonging to the same encounter but plays at a different stage of the fight than anything in the shipped game. This track is a musical piece, not an ambient sound or voice line. It is a complete composition with a clear structure, approximately 90 seconds long, with a beginning and an end. It is not simply an unfinished loop. It is a finished piece that was not placed in the encounter. Based on its emotional register and tempo, it would fit a third phase transition, if such a phase had existed. The blood-starved beast fight has geometry in its arena that includes a raised section at the far end of the room. This raised section is accessible, but contains nothing, and serves no function in the fight. The layout of the room would suggest this area was designed for a mechanic or event that never made it into the final encounter. For a game in the Soulsborne genre, unused elevated terrain in a boss arena is often associated with either a ranged attack safe zone that was cut or a multi-stage mechanic that involved different arena sections. The Living Failures fight in the DLC has an arena that is significantly larger than the encounter seems to require. The Living Failures do not make use of most of the garden's space during the fight, and the projectile rain attack they use is the only mechanic that seems to actively engage the full arena. One reading of this is that the fight was originally designed to have more enemies simultaneously active, requiring players to navigate a larger space. The current encounter has a relatively low number of failures active at any given time, which makes the arena feel somewhat underutilized. The research hall has doors that are locked with no apparent purpose. Several doorways in the area are sealed by mechanisms that the player never receives the means to open. The area is designed as a linear path through a corrupted medical facility, and the locked doors branch off from this path in ways that suggest additional rooms or a different routing was planned. The area beyond some of these doors is not empty space. The geometry of adjacent rooms suggests there is something beyond them, though what exactly is there would require tools outside of normal gameplay to determine. The Bloodletting Beast, the boss accessed through the Nightmare of Cainhurst in data, but not shipped as a standard encounter, has collision data suggesting it was designed for a very specific arena shape. The arena shape implied by its collision, avoidance behavior, does not match any existing space in the game. This beast was clearly designed with a specific encounter location in mind, and that location either does not exist in the shipped game or was repurposed for something else. The Bloodletting Beast has an unusual property in its incomplete shipping state. It can be forced to appear in the game through specific modifications, and when it does appear, it behaves like a complete and functional boss. The encounter design around it is finished. It has a balanced health pool, it has a full set of animations, and it has a death state with a complete death animation. The only thing missing is a legitimate in-game location for the encounter. Chapter 4. The abandoned Yharnam sections and what the map data reveals. Bloodborne's Yharnam is built as a coherent city with geography that extends beyond what the player can access. The streets you walk through are connected to larger structures, implied by the architecture around them, and data mining has confirmed that the geography of the city was designed on a larger scale than the final game makes accessible. This is not unusual for an open-world game, but Bloodborne presents itself as a relatively constrained space, so the evidence of a much larger world sitting just outside the accessible areas is striking. The most significant example of this is the Forbidden Woods, which has accessible geometry beyond the boss fog gate that includes what appears to be a continuation of the village section. The village in the Forbidden Woods is one of the most detailed environmental areas in the game, with individual houses, interiors, and a layout that suggests a functioning community before the plague. The continuation geometry beyond the accessible boundary maintains this level of detail for an area roughly as large as the part the player can visit. Players who have accessed this continuation geometry through boundary breaks describe it as containing multiple interiors with object placements that suggest the space was in an advanced state of development. It is not raw geometry. It has textures, object placements, and in at least one case a doorway that suggests it was intended to connect to another accessible area. The geometry terminates at a clean edge rather than trailing off into unfinished territory, which suggests this was a completed section that was removed from the connected game world rather than a partially built section that was abandoned. The Cainhurst Castle approach has geometry extending beyond the coach arrival point that the player cannot reach by normal means. The coach you ride to Cainhurst arrives at the castle's main gate, and the available area includes the approach path, the castle interior, and several towers. But the exterior geography of the castle at a certain distance from the playable area shows additional structure. A section of what appears to be a servant's wing or secondary building complex exists in the geometry at a remove from the main castle that the player can never reach. The most interesting element of this inaccessible geometry is that it contains several chest-shaped objects. These objects use the same model as the chests found in the accessible sections of Cainhurst, where they contain valuable items. The chests in the inaccessible area are closed, meaning they retain their initial state, which is the same state they would be in before any player interaction. Whether these chests were meant to be accessible and contain items, or whether they are leftover objects from a development build placed during environment dressing and never cleaned up, is unknown. The lower Pthumeru Chalice dungeon has a section of geometry that behaves unusually under the game's rendering rules. In most of the Chalice dungeons, the geometry is procedurally assembled from pre-built tile sets, and the rendering draws and dismisses geometry based on proximity. In this particular dungeon's second layer, there is a room that renders at a greater distance than the surrounding rooms. The geometry is drawn from further away, meaning the engine is treating it as a more important element of the world than its neighbours. This rendering priority is usually reserved for significant areas or landmarks. The room in question is not remarkable by any visible standard. It is a standard dungeon room with standard enemy placements, but the fact that the engine treats it as more significant than surrounding rooms suggests either that its rendering priority setting was set manually by a developer for reasons that were not documented, or that the room was originally part of a fixed dungeon section before being integrated into the procedural system. The fixed Chalice dungeons, the ones that do not procedurally generate and instead have a consistent layout each time they are played, have several rooms that have no enemies and no items, but have environmental details that suggest occupation or use. Empty rooms in Chalice dungeons are not unusual, but these rooms have interactive elements that serve no function. Coffins that can be opened to find nothing. Doors that can be opened to reveal empty spaces. These elements require player interaction to engage but provide nothing in return. The sinister Chalice dungeons, which are generated with additional difficulty modifiers, have a category of room that appears very rarely but has been documented by the community. This room type has no standard dungeon appearance and instead has a completely different architectural style that does not match any other room type in the dungeon system. Players who have encountered it describe it as having a ceiling significantly higher than standard dungeon rooms, a different floor texture that appears to be unfinished stone rather than the dressed stone of normal dungeon tiles, and no enemies or items. This room type has been called the anomaly room by the community for lack of a better term, and its appearance seems to be weighted extremely low in the procedural generation system, making it very rare. Whether it represents a genuine content feature that was never activated or an artifact of a test architecture that was accidentally included in the generation pool is unknown. The Eyes Root dungeon set has geometry in its deepest layers that matches the visual language of the Dreamlands. The arcane space is accessed via specific Carol runes that represent the world beyond the Great Ones. ISE is described in item descriptions as the ancestral homeland of the Cosmos Kin, the alienated creatures that have moved beyond human form through prolonged contact with the arcane. The connection between Ice and the Great Ones is stronger than the connection between any other Chalice dungeon region and any specific lore element. When you reach the deepest accessible layer of Is, the architectural vocabulary of the space shifts in a way that is not mirrored in other dungeon regions. Stone gives way to a material that has a different texture response to the game's lighting system. This material appears in Murgo's Nightmare in a different context. The same material, appearing in both spaces, suggests a connection between Eyes and the Nightmare that the game does not explicitly confirm through any text or dialogue. The Thumerians, the pre-human civilization that built the Chalice dungeons, have material evidence throughout the dungeons that suggests a more complex culture than the game acknowledges in its accessible content. The available item descriptions reference the Pithumerians as ritual specialists who held the blood of the Great Ones, but the architecture of their tombs includes spaces that appear to have been domestic rather than ceremonial. Residential quarters, storage areas, spaces that suggest the Chalice dungeons were not solely ritual spaces, but were lived in. If the Pithumerians lived in the Chalice dungeons rather than simply maintaining them, the nature of their civilization and its relationship to the Great Ones becomes more complex. A civilization that built temple complexes for worship is different from one that built its actual homes inside those complexes. The difference suggests the Thumerians may not have experienced the boundary between the mundane world and the sacred space of the Great Ones in the same way the people of Yharnam do. Chapter 5. Carol Runes and the Data that does not add up. The Carol rune system in Bloodborne is presented as a set of transcriptions of the Great One's voices recorded by the hunter-scholar runesmith Carol. The mechanics of the system, slotting runes to gain passive bonuses, are clear. What is less clear is the relationship between the visual forms of the runes and their effects. The game's lore suggests a one-to-one relationship between the inscribed shape and its function. The data does not entirely support this. Several runes in the game have effect values that do not scale the way the visual complexity of their inscriptions would suggest. The more complex rune inscriptions typically correspond to more powerful or more specialized effects, but there are outliers where simple inscriptions have complex effects and vice versa. This inconsistency might simply reflect the non-human origin of the runes, the idea that human logic does not apply to how the Great Ones organize meaning, but it might also reflect the fact that the rune system was revised during development and some of the original associations between form and effect were changed. The Communion rune has 3 tiers that increase the player's maximum number of blood vials. The visual progression of these 3 tiers does not follow the pattern established by other tiered rune sets. In every other tiered rune set in the game, the higher tiers represent additions or modifications of the lower tier's inscription. The communion rune tiers are instead 3 different inscriptions with no visible ancestral relationship to each other. This suggests either that the 3 communion runes were originally unrelated runes that were grouped together by function, or that the visual design of the rune series was changed mid-development without the lore coherence of the tier relationship being maintained. The Clawmark rune, which increases visceral attack damage, has a description that references the beast inside all hunters. This is thematically consistent, but the visual form of the Clawmark rune bears a resemblance to a specific marking found in Canehurst, visible on the castle's exterior stonework. Canehurst and the beast are opposed thematically in the game's fiction. Canehurst represents the aristocratic pursuit of blood elevation through lineage rather than through the hunt, a different and rival ideology to the Healing Church's beast-focused framework. The shared visual language between the Clawmark rune and Canehurst architecture is either an oversight or something more deliberate. The beast rune has data in its file that suggests it was once associated with a different mechanical effect than its current one. Its current effect is a passive increase to the player's physical attack power that also increases the build-up of the beasthood bar. The file structure for this rune includes a reference to a function that no longer exists in the game's code, suggesting the rune originally interacted with a mechanic that was cut before the game shipped. The function the beast rune references is named in a way that suggests it controlled a transformation state. Bloodborne shipped with the beasthood bar as a scaling buff, but several pieces of evidence suggest a full transformation state was planned at one point. The beast rune referencing this cut function is consistent with other evidence pointing toward a cut transformation system. The cleric beast is a former hunter who fully transformed. The game had planned for the player to reach some version of that state. The eye rune has 3 tiers associated with increasing discovery and awareness. Its description references the eye of the beholder, a great one connected to insight. But the eye rune's visual does not appear to reference any specific anatomical eye structure. It is an abstracted symbol that has been interpreted in multiple ways by different community members. Interestingly, the rune for the eye, when reflected and mirrored in specific ways, shows a visual match to the umbilical cord item's appearances seen in the inventory, though this match is approximate rather than exact. The 1/3 of umbilical cord items are lore-critical objects in the game, and the connection between them and a rune associated with a heightened perception is thematically loaded but never explicitly confirmed in text. If the eye rune is visually related to the cords, it suggests that insight as a mechanic and the umbilical cords as lore objects are part of the same conceptual system within the game's design. That awareness of the Great Ones and physical connection to them are understood as related phenomena. The moon rune, which increases the number of blood echoes obtained from enemies, has a description that connects it to the moon presence. This seems obvious, but the moon rune's description also references the moon drawing life to itself, which is consistent with the moon presence's apparent goal of keeping the hunter in the dream cycle. The rune that makes the hunt more efficient in terms of blood echo collection is associated with the entity that perpetuates the hunt. This alignment of mechanical function and lore meaning is one of the more elegant designs in the game's rune system. There is a rune visible on certain surfaces in the Healing Church workshop and the abandoned old workshop that does not match any rune in the game's accessible item inventory. It appears in 3 locations in these areas and nowhere else in the game. Players who have tried to match this rune's inscription against every rune in the data have found no match among the shipped items. Whether this is a decorative element, a reference to a cut rune, or something placed with more intent is unclear. The guidance rune, which appears in the Chalice dungeons and gives the player a ranking in PvP and co-op contexts, has a description that references the choir, the upper echelon of the Healing Church. The connection between guidance and the choir is not developed elsewhere in the game. The choir's methods of achieving communion with the Great Ones, are implied to be more extreme than the general churches, and the idea that they developed a rune associated with guiding other hunters fits within that characterization, but the specifics of when and why they made this rune are never explained. Chapter 6. The doll's dialogue and the lines that did not ship the doll in the hunter's dream is one of the most written about characters in the game's community. She is the figure you interact with most frequently, she levels the player up, and she provides emotional grounding for the hunter's experience. Her dialogue is memorable, and her characterization is unusual for a game like this. She is warm, she is aware, and she is clearly holding something back. What the community has not focused on as much is the evidence in the dialogue file data that the doll was originally scripted to have more to say. The shipped dialogue tree for the doll is not complete in the sense of a fully realized character arc. It covers several topics and has a few variant lines based on specific game states, but the file structure suggests additional branches were planned. The most significant of these missing branches appears to involve Yharnam more directly. Several triggers in the doll's dialogue file reference Yharnam's quest state in ways that are never used in the final game. If Yharnam's state is set to a specific value that is never actually achieved through normal gameplay, the doll is supposed to deliver a line or set of lines that are not in the shipped audio. The line data slots are present, the audio files are absent. This suggests either that the lines were recorded and then removed from the final audio build, or that the lines were planned and the scripting was implemented before the voice recording session, at which point the lines were cut before recording. The former scenario would mean the lines exist somewhere as audio. The latter would mean they were only ever text. The doll's interactions with the hunter's dream environment include reactions to certain events that most players never see, because triggering them requires specific actions in a specific order. One of these reactions occurs when the player has obtained all of the 1/3 of umbilical cord pieces, but has not yet confronted Yharnam. In this state, if you speak to the doll, her dialogue references a tension that she does not name, but that colours the conversation differently than normal. The specific phrasing she uses has been analysed extensively because it appears to be a direct acknowledgement that she is aware of what the player is about to do. The doll's voice direction in her shipped lines has a quality that is consistent with a character who is choosing her words carefully. The pauses she takes before certain phrases are longer than natural speech cadence would require. This could be performance style, or it could reflect script direction that asks the actor to convey deliberateness. In the context of a character who might know more than she lets on, this deliberateness reads as restraint rather than hesitation. The doll's description as something Yharnam created from a person he was close to is established clearly in item descriptions. She's modelled on a student of his, presumably Lady Maria, based on multiple converging pieces of evidence. The doll exists as a functional copy of a person who later became one of the most significant figures in the DLC's story. The emotional weight of this is acknowledged in the game through small moments in the doll's dialogue, but the full scope of what it means is left for the player to construct. When you speak to the doll in the one version of the ending, where you accept Yharnam's offer and he ends the dream cycle, the doll has a final line of dialogue that is different from her standard farewell. This line is quiet and has a different recording environment than her other lines, a closer microphone position that makes the voice feel more intimate. The choice to change the recording setup for specifically this line was a production decision made to mark it as emotionally distinct from everything else, she says. The doll cries. This is a fact most players know. She's the only character in the game who has a visible crying state, and she enters this state under a specific condition that the game does not explain to the player. If you kill her in the dream, she will respawn as all dream-based entities do, but when she respawns, she is crying. She will continue to cry for a period before returning to her normal state. The crying state is a complete and fully implemented character state, with its own audio, animation loop, and dialogue variants. The crying dialogue variants have never been analysed as extensively as her standard lines, because triggering the crying state requires an action that most players do not take, killing the only NPC who can level you up. But those who have listened to the crying dialogue report that the doll's lines in this state include references to the hunter's capacity for violence that do not appear in any of her other dialogue. She is not condemning the player in these lines. She is describing the violence in a way that suggests she understands it as part of what hunters are, and finding that understanding painful. The doll's knowledge of the player's actions in the world outside the dream is limited but not absent. She comments on certain achievements and certain discoveries in ways that suggest she's aware of at least some of what happens in Yharnam. The mechanism by which she receives this information is never explained. Whether she is connected to the moon presence and therefore receives information through that relationship, or whether the dream itself informs her of events in the waking nightmare, or whether the game is simply using her as a narrative device without worrying too much about the information channel, is left open. Her awareness of the player finding the abandoned workshop is particularly notable. The first time you visit the dream after reaching the abandoned workshop, a small change in her standard greeting line is present if you know to listen for it. The change is subtle. A single word replaced with a synonym that carries a different emotional connotation. The change is small enough that many playthroughs miss it entirely, but it has been confirmed by multiple players who have specifically tested this sequence. The relationship between the doll and the moon presence is one of the most debated topics in the community, and for good reason. The moon presence is the ultimate power behind the hunter's dream. The doll is the dream's steward. The connection between them is never stated, but the doll's apparent knowledge, her permanence in the dream, and her role in the leveling mechanic, which involves the transfer of blood echoes that are themselves a form of Great One communion, all suggest she is more than she appears. Chapter 7. Ludwig's Holy Blade and Objects that should not behave the way they do. Bloodborne's weapon system involves a split between normal and transformed states, and most weapons follow predictable rules in how they transition between these states and what each state's moveset emphasizes. Ludwig's Holy Blade is unusual within this system because its transformed mode, the Greatsword state, has physics and collision behavior that differs from other large weapons in the game in ways that data miners have been trying to explain for years. The primary issue is that the Holy Blade in its transformed state has a hitbox that extends behind the player character's body during specific swing animations. This is visible to players in PvP contexts where the backside hit will register on an opponent standing behind the player at the moment the swing connects from the front. This behavior is not present in other large weapons with similar swing arcs. The hitbox is specifically shaped to include rear coverage in a way that other swords of comparable size do not. This property is significant enough that it has shaped the game's PvP metagame in specific ways, particularly in areas where players frequently engage each other. The Holy Blade's ability to hit enemies behind the player in certain animations is treated by the community as a feature, rather than a bug because it is so consistent and so difficult to explain as an accident. A hitbox that consistently covers a specific space requires deliberate placement. The Burial Blade, Gehrman's weapon, has a wind hitbox that is separate from its primary blade hitbox. This wind hitbox is responsible for the blade's extended range in its transformed state, and it is implemented as a separate damage volume that activates a fraction of a second after the primary hit. This stagger is what creates the feeling of the wind cutting slightly after the blade. The wind hitbox also extends in a direction that is slightly off axis from the blade's actual swing path, creating a situation where the wind damage can hit targets that were not in the blade's path. This off-axis behavior is very small in practice, but in specific circumstances, it creates hits that seem to come from an unexpected direction. Yharnam himself uses this weapon, and his use of it in the endgame fight benefits from this property. His swings occasionally hit players who believed they were outside the attack's range, because they were accounting for the blade's path without accounting for the wind hitbox's offset. The saw cleaver has an interaction with certain enemy types that produces a damage result inconsistent with its listed damage values and upgrade state. Against kin enemies, the saw cleaver in its transformed state deals approximately 8 to 12% more damage than its stats would suggest. This has been confirmed through controlled testing and is not explained by any obvious modifier in the game's visible systems. The kin damage modifier should not apply to the saw cleaver, because it is not listed as having a kin bonus. One hypothesis is that the saw cleaver's serrated bonus, which applies to beasts, was accidentally applied to a secondary damage category that overlaps with certain kin enemy types in the game's damage type classification system. If the internal classification of certain kin enemies includes a tag that the serrated bonus also checks against, the result would be an undocumented damage bonus, appearing only against those specific enemies. This kind of classification error is extremely common in complex game systems and does not require any deliberate design decision to produce. The Rakuyo has a visual property during its transformed state that has been described as incorrect by players who know the weapon well. In the transformed mode, the weapon splits into two short swords held in a dual-wield stance. The offhand sword's idle animation has it rotating very slightly around its center axis on a continuous loop. This rotation is so small that it is barely perceptible during normal play, but is visible when the player is standing still in the right lighting conditions. The rotation is not present in the main hand sword's idle animation. Only the offhand has it. The rotation rate is consistent and does not speed up or slow down based on any condition. It simply spins, very slightly, forever. This is a small animation detail that was either deliberate, a tiny rotation added to suggest the weapon is alive in some sense, or an artifact of the animation process, where a slight error in the rotation value of a bone was never corrected because it was too small to notice in motion. The Lagarius wheel has a damage calculation that involves multiple internal steps visible in the game's damage formula. The wheel's transformation converts a portion of its physical damage into arcane damage based on the player's arcane stat. This conversion is documented and understood. What is less discussed is that the conversion formula has an additional multiplicative step at very high arcane values, above 50, that accelerates the conversion rate beyond what the stated formula would predict. This is either an intended scaling cliff at high arcane or an overflow error in the formula's code. Weapons with charged R2 attacks, of which the Lagarius wheel is one, have a general property where the charged attack hitbox persists for slightly longer than the animation would visually suggest. This means that if a player is near the hitbox zone as it expires, they can take damage without seeing a hit animation connect with their character visually. This discrepancy between visual and mechanical timing is small, but consistent across all charged R2 attacks in the game. The Tonitrus, a weapon that converts its physical damage to bolt damage upon transformation, has an interaction with the game's rally system that is not fully explained by the system's documentation. The Tonitrus is a short-range weapon, and the rally mechanic, which allows players to regain health by dealing damage immediately after being hit, should function the same way for all weapons. But the Tonitrus in its transformed state has a rally generation rate slightly higher than weapons with comparable base damage values. This higher rate has been confirmed through testing. One explanation is that the internal damage type used by the Tonitrus's bolt conversion has a hidden modifier on its rally generation coefficient. If bolt damage generates rally at a rate slightly different from physical damage, and if this difference was set intentionally to make the high-risk close-range playstyle of the Tonitrus more viable, then the higher rally rate is a deliberate balancing decision. The alternative is that the rally coefficient for bolt damage was set independently from physical damage, and the resulting difference was not caught. The amygdalan arm has an animation in its transformed state that includes a sound that does not match its visual. During the overhead slam attack, the impact sound fires at a slightly different time than the visual impact. This audio-visual desync is small enough that it does not interfere with readability during gameplay, but it is audible once you know to listen for it. The mismatch has been present since the DLC released and has never been patched, suggesting it was either accepted as part of the weapon's character or was not noticed during quality assurance. Chapter 8. The Moon Presence and the End of the Night. The Moon Presence is the final boss of the true ending and the entity responsible for maintaining the hunter's dream. It is also one of the least understood entities in the game, partly because the game provides very little direct information about it, and partly because what it does in the true ending is itself ambiguous. It appears after you consume the umbilical cords and refuse Yharnam's offer. It attacks, and then it stops. The Moon Presence's combat behaviour during the fight includes a mechanic that is unique to this boss in the entire game. When it reduces the player's health to a low threshold during its transformation attack, it does not kill the player. The health drops as low as 1, and then the visual distortion and the audio of the attack continue, but the player survives. This survival is presented as the player becoming a Great One, the transformation triggered by the umbilical cords taking full effect. The mechanic is elegant in design because it uses a near-death moment to signal a change in the player character's nature. The data around this mechanic shows that the health clamp, the point at which the Moon Presence stops reducing the player's health, was adjusted multiple times during development. There are version references in the boss's file that correspond to different clamp values, and the shipped value is not the lowest that was ever tested. At some point during development, the clamp was set to a much lower value that might have made the transformation feel more harrowing, before being adjusted upward to the current 1 health state. The Moon Presence's design is one of the most analysed in the game because its visual language borrows from multiple real-world traditions in specific ways. Its primary form suggests a very large arachnid, but the web of limbs it uses to move does not follow arachnid locomotion. The movement is more like the way a sea creature might move in low gravity, a floating rather than a crawling. This quality of movement was clearly chosen deliberately as part of communicating the Moon Presence's nature as something beyond terrestrial life. The coloration of the Moon Presence changes slightly between its arrival cutscene and the fight itself. In the cutscene, its palette is more blue-tinted. In the fight, it shifts toward purple. This shift is subtle enough that most players do not notice it consciously, but it corresponds to an established color coding in the game's visual language where blue represents the arcane and purple represents the nightmare layer. The Moon Presence is transitioning between the dream it maintains and the nightmare it also inhabits. The arena for the Moon Presence fight is the hunter's dream itself, which transforms when the fight begins. The flowers are still present, the lanterns are still present, but the sky changes, and the quality of the light changes with it. The transformation of the familiar dream space into a hostile arena is one of the most effective environment design choices in the game. You are fighting for control of the only safe space you have known throughout the entire experience. The Moon Presence's health pool is lower than many players expect for a final boss. The decision to make the final boss of the true ending relatively fragile compared to earlier bosses was deliberate, and it serves the narrative. By the time you reach the Moon Presence, you have consumed 3 pieces of Great One's power. The fight is not supposed to be a prolonged struggle. It is supposed to feel like an assertion of the transformation that has already taken place in the player character. The audio design of the Moon Presence fight draws from multiple pieces of the game's existing soundtrack. Several motifs that appeared in other boss encounters and in the ambient music of the game's locations are combined and distorted in the Moon Presence's battle music. This creates a feeling that the fight is a summation of the entire experience, rather than a standalone encounter. The familiar sounds pulled out of context and combined in a new arrangement. After the moon presence falls and the true ending sequence begins, the music fades to near silence. In that near silence, before the final cutscene plays, there is a single audio element that persists. It is the ambient sound of the hunter's dream. The flowers, the wind, the distant sounds of the dream's constructed world. This ambient loop plays for approximately 8 seconds of near silence before the cutscene audio begins. Those 8 seconds are the game giving the player a moment in the dream that is quiet for perhaps the first time. The true ending cutscene involves Yharnam's dissolution and the appearance of a small creature, the transformed hunter. This creature is the Great One form that the umbilical cords and the transformation have produced. The creature's design has been analysed for what it might tell us about the Great One's relationship to humanity, and the consensus in the community is that the design intentionally preserves human-scale features in a form that is clearly no longer human. Eyes remain. A general bilateral symmetry remains, but the scale and the context are entirely different. Yharnam's final lines before the dawn are often quoted but less often examined for their specific word choices. He describes the hunter's return as going back to the dream. He does not say escape, he does not say freedom. He says back, implying a return to something that already existed rather than a movement towards something new. The true ending of Bloodborne is not presented as a triumphant escape from the dream cycle. It is presented as a deeper integration into it, a graduation into a different role within the same system that has always been in place. The final image before the credits is the smallest thing in the game's ending sequence, and the one that has generated the most discussion. The little girl you encounter on the steps of Udon Chapel, if she survived the night through the right sequence of choices, appears in the dawn light at the game's conclusion. She looks at the creature the hunter has become. The shot holds, no music, the ambient sound of early morning, and then the credits. This moment does not resolve anything. The girl is alive. The hunter has become something beyond human. The city of Yharnam is behind them both. The game does not tell you whether this is hope or continuation, or something else entirely. It gives you the image and lets you hold it. That unresolved image is the final anomaly in Bloodborne, a conclusion that refuses to be conclusive, an ending that acts more like a long pause before whatever comes next. Chapter 9. The Rom Connection and Forgotten Lore. Threads in the Spider Boss Arena. Rom, the vacuous spider, is one of the game's pivotal bosses in terms of narrative function. Killing her lifts the veil from the lunar presence over Yharnam and makes the more extreme manifestations of the nightmare world visible. Before her death, the amygdala statues on the rooftops of Yharnam are invisible to everyone but the player, whose high insight allows them to see what others cannot. After her death, the amygdalas are visible to all, and the world changes in ways that reflect the literal reality breaking through. This mechanic is elegant and well understood. What is less understood is the backstory of how Rom came to be, and why a vacuous spider is the thing holding the veil in place. The word vacuous in her name comes from an item description that references her as having been a scholar who underwent a transformation. Scholars in Bloodborne's world are connected to the healing church's upper tiers, the research arms of the institution that sought direct contact with the Great Ones. Rom's transformation into an arachnid form is presented as the result of this contact going wrong, or going right, depending on your perspective. The spider form itself is interesting because Bloodborne's beast plague produces a specific kind of transformation, the beast type, and the kin type is associated with different kinds of transformation. Rom is clearly neither beast nor kin in the simple sense. She is something categorized separately. The babies that accompany her in the fight are the same type as her, small versions of the spider form that do no damage on their own, but distract and complicate the encounter. The babies have no clear narrative explanation for their existence. Rom did not reproduce in any conventional sense. They are associated with her in the way that the small creatures associated with other boss encounters are associated with those bosses, as extensions or emanations rather than as independent organisms. The lore of Bloodborne treats Great Ones as entities capable of producing children that are not the result of biological reproduction in the conventional sense. The umbilical cords are connected to this idea. Rom's babies fit into this general framework. The Moonside Lake, where the Rom fight takes place, has geometry that extends beyond the visible play area. Players who have tested the boundary of the lake's surface have found that the walkable geometry continues further in one direction than the encounter's design requires. This extended geometry is not developed beyond its basic surface, meaning no objects, no enemies, and no special terrain features are placed there. It is a continuation of the lake's surface that the player never needs to use during the fight. The sky texture used in the Moonside Lake arena is one of the most complex in the game. The moon is at a specific position in the sky that it does not occupy in any other outdoor area. The position is consistent with an astronomical position that would be significant in certain cultural traditions associated with liminal states, moments of transition between one condition and another. Whether the art team was thinking in these terms when they placed the moon is impossible to confirm, but the choice is deliberate at minimum in the sense that sky composition in a game is not accidental. The water in the lake does not behave like water in other parts of the game. Bloodborne has water in several locations, and in most of those locations, the water has a specific audio response to the player's movement. The Moonside Lake has no water audio. The player moves through it silently. This is clearly an intentional choice, because the silence during the fight contributes to the dreamlike quality of the space. But from a technical standpoint, it required the water audio to be specifically disabled for this area while being active in other areas with similar geometry. Rom's death triggers one of the game's most significant world state changes. The visible effects of this change, the amygdalas on the rooftops, the blood moon sky, and the changed dialogue of several NPCs, are all documented and discussed, but there is a less discussed category of change that happens at the same time. Certain background audio tracks in outdoor areas shift in the blood moon state. The ambient night sounds that play in most of Yharnam acquire an additional low-frequency layer that was not present before Rom's death. This layer is consistent across the areas it appears in and was specifically added to the blood moon world state. The specific frequency of this added ambient layer has been measured and matches a frequency associated with psychological stress responses in audio research. This is consistent with how the game treats the post-ROM world state as more dangerous and more honestly terrible than the earlier state, where the horrors were hidden by the veil. The audio design supports the world state change, not just through obviously different sounds, but through a subtle tonal shift that listeners register without necessarily identifying. Iosefka, after the blood moon, is one of the most discussed NPC moments in the game. The Iosefka you find in the clinic after Rom's death is not the same person as the one you interacted with before, having been replaced by an infiltrator from the choir. The choir's agenda in the game involves experimenting with humans to produce kin, and the imposter Iosefka is conducting this research in the original Iosefka's clinic. The details of what she is doing and why are established through item descriptions and her dialogue. What is less discussed is the specific type of kin that the results of her experiments produce. The patient she sends away through her door before the blood moon, advising people to wait at her clinic for their own safety, are undergoing a transformation that produces the celestial emissary type. This type of kin is connected to the choir's larger agenda of producing a child with a great one. The patients are not simply being used as experimental subjects for research purposes. in an abstract sense. They are participants in a specific ritual program designed to produce a specific result. The celestial emissary boss that appears in the game is the end result of this program, a mass of these transformed individuals fused into something with the properties of a Great One's emanation. The boss is accessed through the Healing Church workshop in a way that requires specific NPC interactions to unlock. This routing, and the fact that the boss is explicitly the product of church research, makes the celestial emissary fight one of the most directly political in the game. You are confronting the result of a specifically ideological program. The celestial emissary's boss room has a window that looks out onto Yharnam's skyline from a vantage point that does not correspond to any identifiable location in the game's map. The architecture visible through the window is consistent with Yharnam's visual language, but the specific view is one that could not be seen from any exterior point accessible to the player. This is either a deliberate artistic choice to create an impossible window, or the result of the room being positioned in the world in a place where such a view would be physically plausible. The transition from the celestial emissary fight to the garden where Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, waits is one of the most atmospheric in the game. The fog gate between these areas has a longer loading time than most fog gates, and the ambient audio of the area changes significantly as you pass through. The garden where Ebrietas waits is deeply quiet compared to most combat areas, and this quiet is maintained throughout the fight in a way that distinguishes it from the more bombastic encounters in the game. Ebrietas is described as a great one who was left behind, who was found in the labyrinth below Yharnam by the early choir, and was treated as a source of wisdom and communion material. The relationship between Ebrietas and the church is bilateral in a way that other Great One relationships in the game are not. Other Great Ones are worshipped from below, communed with at a distance, or encountered as incomprehensible presences. Ebrietas was a partner of a sort, albeit an unequal one, to the choir's researchers. Chapter 10. NPC questlines with missing chapters. The NPC questlines in Bloodborne have a reputation for being cryptic and easy to fail. This is accurate, but beyond the difficulty of navigating them, several questlines in the game have evidence of longer, more developed arcs that were compressed or truncated in the shipped version. Jura in Old Yharnam is one of the most discussed NPCs in the game. His role as the defender of the beasts, the old hunter who has taken the position that the beasts of Old Yharnam were once people and deserve to die in peace rather than be hunted by later generations, is one of the most morally complex positions in the game. His dialogue when you approach him without hostility is some of the best writing in the experience. The truncation of his story is visible in the available options for resolving his questline. You can talk him down from hostility through an indirect approach. You can kill him directly. You can agree to leave the beasts alone and receive his gesture and badge as a reward. These outcomes are all functional, but the conversation that leads to the peaceful resolution feels compressed. There are dialogue references to a longer history that Jura is not given space to fully articulate. His past as a hunter and his specific reasons for abandoning the hunt are touched on, but not developed. Item descriptions give more context than he is able to provide in dialogue. The fact that the item descriptions are necessary to understand him suggests that dialogue was planned and was cut, leaving the items to carry the narrative weight that conversation would have addressed. Patches in Bloodborne is a version of the recurring From Software character, presented here as Patches the Spider. His questline involves the cathedral area and a sequence where he offers you to a brainsucker enemy in a pit. The questline progresses through several stages that are each mechanically interesting and tonally consistent with how Patches has functioned in other From Software games. What is notable about the Patches questline is that it terminates earlier than several other NPC questlines in the game in terms of how many stages it has. Other major questlines in Bloodborne have more interaction points spread across the game's second and third acts. Patches' questline is largely resolved in the game's first act. Whether this is appropriate compression for a recurring character who does not need extensive development, or whether a longer questline was planned and cut, is suggested by the fact that Patches has a presence in the game world in locations that his questline never explicitly sends him to. He is found in positions in the cathedral area that suggest he has been spending time there. The implication is that his life between questline stages includes activities the player never directly witnesses. In a longer questline, some of these implied activities might have been developed into interactions. The shipped version of his questline feels like a summary of something that was originally more extended. Ariana is another NPC whose questline has evidence of additional content. Her role is to provide a safe location during the blood moon and to produce the blood-drunk Cainhurst blood as a reward for the player's help. The blood moon revelation about her lineage, her Cainhurst bloodline, is presented as a discovery rather than as context she provides herself. She does not know her own heritage in a meaningful way when you speak to her. The discovery of her Cainhurst bloodline through her blood's effect is elegant game design, but the aftermath of this discovery, from the player's perspective and potentially from Ariana's, is underdeveloped. The game does not give Ariana dialogue that responds to this revelation. She simply continues in her established speech patterns. In a longer questline, there might have been a moment where this information was shared with her, or where its implications were addressed in some way. Chapter 11. The Blood Echoes system and its hidden properties. Blood Echoes are the game's primary currency and experience system, and their implementation has several properties that are not fully explained by the game's visible documentation. The basic function is well understood. Enemies drop echoes when defeated, echoes are used to level up, and dying causes echoes to be dropped at the point of death and retrieved by returning to that location. The retrieval mechanic has a property that most players discover empirically, but do not think about in terms of its underlying logic. When you die, your echoes are left at the location of your death as a ghost that you must touch to retrieve them. If you die a second time before retrieving them, the earlier echo pool is lost and only the echoes from your second death are retrievable. This is the documented behaviour. The undocumented behaviour involves what happens when the echo ghost is touched under specific conditions. If the player's current echo count when touching the ghost is equal to a specific multiple of the dropped echo count, the retrieval animation plays twice. This is an animation only, not a double retrieval of the echo amount. But the trigger for this double animation has never been explained in any official documentation. Players who have tested this confirm the condition, but cannot explain why it exists. One hypothesis is that the double animation was originally associated with a mechanic, where specific retrieval conditions resulted in a bonus echo amount. If the retrieval was reworked during development, the bonus mechanic might have been removed, while the trigger condition for the animation remained in the code. The animation fires, but the associated reward does not. The Beast Claws weapon, one of the DLC additions, has a relationship with blood echoes that is unusual. Wearing the claws in both the main hand and offhand simultaneously, while in the beasthood state, produces a blood echo gain modifier that is not documented anywhere in the game's visible information. Enemies defeated in this state yield approximately 5 to 7% more blood echoes than the same enemies would yield without the beasthood modifier active. This bonus has been confirmed across multiple test conditions. The Hunter's Bone gesture item causes the hunter to perform a specific movement that has a blood echo interaction. When the gesture is performed adjacent to a blood echo ghost, the ghost disappears without the echoes being added to the player's count. The echoes are simply removed from the game state. This behaviour is consistent and repeatable, and it is entirely undocumented. Using the gesture near an echo ghost destroys the echoes without reward. Whether this is a bug where the gesture interaction code improperly triggers the echo retrieval removal condition without the retrieval part, or whether it was a deliberate design choice from some earlier iteration of how the gesture was supposed to work, is unknown. The behavior is harmful to the player in practical terms, but is consistent enough to be documented as a property of the item rather than a random failure. The air rune set increases blood echo gain from visceral attacks. The scaling of this bonus at higher tiers of the rune follows a pattern that is slightly different from what the numbers in the description would suggest. The description states flat bonus values for each tier. The actual bonus applied at high-level characters in specific circumstances is slightly lower than the stated value. The discrepancy is small enough to be within the margin of error for most testing, but players who have done very controlled testing with matched conditions report the discrepancy consistently. Chapter 12. Environmental storytelling in locations. Most players rush through. Bloodborne's environmental storytelling is one of its most praised features. The objects placed in rooms, the positions of bodies, the notes that appear on walls and floors, all of these contribute to a reading of the world that goes beyond what dialogue and item descriptions provide. But certain areas of the game receive significantly less analytical attention than others, partly because they're more difficult to navigate, and partly because they do not appear on the main critical path in obvious ways. The Hypogean jail is one of these areas. Accessed through capture by hunters of hunters, the jail is a prison inside the nightmare layer of Yharnam. The prisoners here are unusual because they include both beasts and what appear to be ordinary Yharnam citizens at various stages of transformation. The coexistence of these groups in the same facility suggests something about how the Yharnam school of Mensis was managing its population before the events of the main game's night. The cell designs in the Hypogean jail vary in ways that suggest different categories of prisoner. Some cells are heavily reinforced, others are standard stone with no additional features. The heavily reinforced cells correspond in most cases to the location of beast-type enemies. The standard cells more often contain the human-appearing enemies or the bodies of people who have died without transforming. This differentiation suggests the Mensis scholars were making active choices about categorization and containment based on the transformation state of their prisoners. The jail has a room that contains only a chair. The chair is not remarkable in its design. It is the same type of wooden chair found in interiors throughout the game. But this room contains nothing else. No body, no item, no enemy, just a chair in a cell. The cell door is open, the empty chair in an empty cell that the player can choose to enter, but receives nothing for entering, is either a developer whimsy or a very specific narrative statement about absence. The empty chair appears in a specific location in the jail that would place it, if you map the jail's layout against the rest of Yharnam's geography, near the cells that contain the more complete and capable human enemies, rather than near the beast containment. This placement is consistent with the chair belonging to a prisoner who was sufficiently under control to be given furniture, and who is simply no longer present. Whether they escaped, were removed, or transformed in a way that made the chair irrelevant is a story the game does not tell. The Yharnam Chapel, the area's main hub space, has an altar that is distinct from all other altars in the game. It does not face the same direction as most healing church altars. In every other healing church space, the altar faces the entrance of the room, placing the congregation's backs to the door and their faces toward the ceremonial focus. The Yharnam Chapel's altar faces a wall. The congregation, if there ever was one, would have gathered facing a closed surface. This inversion is subtle but deliberate in a game where spatial design carries narrative meaning. One reading is that the Mensis scholars were not conducting conventional healing church worship at this altar. The inversion suggests a different orientation, a different focus for the ritual. The wall the altar faces toward has no visible distinguishing feature. Whatever was on the other side of that wall, or whatever the altar was oriented toward, is not visible from the player's vantage point. The Mensis cage, which appears on the heads of certain Yahargul enemies, and famously on Mikolash, has environmental storytelling implications beyond its obvious function. The cage is described as a device used to elevate one's spiritual eye by holding the brain in place. The enemies wearing these cages are functioning, moving, combat-capable individuals whose brains have been modified to facilitate contact with the arcane. They are walking testimonies to what the Mensis scholars were willing to do to achieve their goals. Mikolash himself has dialogue during the chase sequence that is some of the most discussed in the game. His quotes from Koz, his references to eyes, his general madness are all documented and analysed. But his physical behaviour during the chase, not the dialogue, but the movement, the directions he runs, the rooms he enters and exits, follows a pattern that maps onto a specific layout if you trace it. He is not running randomly. He is running a circuit that he has clearly run many times before, suggesting that this chase is not new for him. He's been chased through these rooms before, probably by his own subordinates, possibly by himself, in some recursive nightmare logic. The lecture rooms in the nightmare are identical to rooms in the main game's lecture building. This is ostensibly because they are the same space reflected in the nightmare layer. But the objects in these rooms differ between the two versions. Specific items and environmental details are present in the nightmare version that are not present in the main game version. The nightmare layer is supposed to be a reflection or echo of the waking world, but these differences suggest it preserves an earlier state of the space, the lecture rooms, as they were before some change was made to the main game version. Chapter 13. The Insight Mechanic and what the numbers conceal. Insight in Bloodborne is one of the most discussed and least fully understood systems in the game. The visible effects of insight are numerous and well documented. Higher insight changes NPC behaviour, reveals certain entities, alters enemy stat values, affects the game's ambient audio, and functions as a second currency for purchasing specific items. The invisible effects of insight are less fully catalogued. The audio changes triggered by insight levels have been studied in detail. At Insight 0, the game's audio mix includes a specific range of ambient sounds and a specific music mix. As insight increases, the audio mix changes in documented ways. The sound of the doll's footsteps becomes audible at certain insight thresholds. Certain enemy vocalizations that are inaudible at low insight become clear at higher insight. The bell woman's bell becomes audible before she visually appears at high insight. What is less documented is an audio change at the absolute maximum insight level, 99, that is distinct from the changes at lower high insight thresholds. At 99 insight, a very faint background element appears in the hunter's dream's ambient audio that is not present at lower insight levels. This element has been described by players who have isolated it as resembling breathing. Not the doll's breathing, which is a distinct and easily identifiable sound effect. A breathing sound that does not correspond to any visible entity in the dream. The breathing element is rhythmic and consistent. It does not vary between visits to the dream. It plays only at 99 insight and disappears immediately if the insight count drops below that threshold. The moon presence is the obvious candidate for the source of this sound within the game's fiction. At maximum insight, the hunter is maximally aware of the hidden reality, and what they can hear at that level of awareness is whatever the moon presence sounds like when it is simply existing rather than acting. The insight requirement for seeing the amygdalas before Rom's death is one of the game's most famous hidden mechanics. The amygdalas are visible at an insight level above a specific threshold. Below that threshold, they're completely invisible to the player and to every NPC in the game. The in-game explanation for this is that insufficient insight prevents perception of the Great Ones, but the player's insight at the point of seeing them for the first time is often not particularly high. The threshold is lower than most players assume, suggesting that most people in Yharnam are closer to being able to see the truth than the world's visual presentation suggests. The fact that the game sets this threshold relatively low rather than high is a choice about how the fiction works. In a world where the truth is visible, at say 60 insight, the people of Yharnam are very far from perceiving their reality. In a world where the truth is visible, at 20 insight, the people of Yharnam are much closer to the edge of perception. Bloodborne's choice places the threshold at a level suggesting the veil is thin. Spending insight at the Insight Bath Messenger shop has a property that is not fully documented. Purchasing items from this vendor reduces insight by the stated cost, but the reduction applies differently to insight gained from different sources. Insight gained from defeating bosses and from finding Great One-related items is reduced first, before insight gained from using Madman's knowledge items. This priority system is implemented in the game's insight tracking code, and is invisible to the player who simply sees the number go down regardless of source. The practical implication of this priority system is that boss insight is more durable than item use insight in terms of how long it persists in the face of purchases. Players who want to maintain specific audio and visual effects tied to insight levels, while also purchasing items from the insight shop, will find it easier to maintain those effects if their insight base comes from boss kills rather than Madman's knowledge consumption. Chapter 14. The Nightmare Frontier and the Forgotten Giants. The Nightmare Frontier is one of the least visited areas in the game. It is optional, it requires a specific item to access, and its rewards are not as immediately compelling as those in other optional areas. As a result, a significant portion of the player base has never explored it thoroughly. This neglect means that the area's environmental storytelling and several of its anomalies are among the least discussed in the community. The area's name describes it well. It is a frontier of the nightmare layer, an edge region rather than a developed nightmare space. The landscape is alien, with large geysers of poison and a ruined architecture that is distinct from any other area in the game. The ruins use a visual language that does not correspond to Yharnam's architecture or to the Chalice Dungeon's architectural style. They suggest a civilization that predates both, or that exists in a parallel to both without being derived from either. The amygdalas in the Nightmare Frontier are unique because they are the only amygdalas in the game that are both visible and attackable without requiring a specific ability. In other areas of the game, amygdalas are either invisible to low insight players, visible but untouchable, or accessible only through specific items. In the Nightmare Frontier, they sit in the landscape as fully physical presences that the player can engage with, flee from, or simply exist near. This visibility and physicality without any barrier suggests the Nightmare Frontier exists at a layer of reality where the division between perception and substance does not apply. The ruins in the area contain objects that predate any identified civilization in Bloodborne's lore. Item descriptions from the area reference a time before the Pthumerians and before the Great One's first contact with humanity. The implication is that the civilization these ruins belong to existed in the Nightmare because it was destroyed before Yharnam existed in any form. Whatever happened to them left traces in the Nightmare layer because the Nightmare layer preserves remnants of traumatic events. The giants that inhabit parts of the Nightmare Frontier are among the most enigmatic enemies in the game. They are not beasts, they are not kin. They are categorized separately in the game's damage system, which means they have their own resistance profile. The item they drop, the Ailing Lauren Chalice, is one of the key items for accessing specific Chalice dungeons. Their connection to Loran, the lost civilization, suggests these giants are either survivors of Loran or are what the people of Loran became after their civilization's end. Loran itself is one of the most underserved parts of Bloodborne's lore. It is referenced repeatedly in item descriptions and in dungeon context as a civilization that preceded Yharnam in its relationship with the Great Ones, and that was destroyed by a great calamity. The nature of the calamity is described as a plague of beasts, making Loran the first known human civilization to fall to the beast plague that later threatened Yharnam. The connection between what happened in Loran and what is happening in the main game is one of the clearest examples of the game's cyclical structure. The Nightmare Frontier's poison geysers have a timing pattern that is not random. Players who have studied the geyser eruption timing have found that the geysers across the area erupt in a coordinated pattern that follows a roughly 4-minute cycle with 3 distinct phases. The coordination of the geysers across a large outdoor space requires centralized timing, meaning the geysers were deliberately programmed to behave in concert rather than independently. The reason for this coordination is never explained in the game. One practical consideration is that coordinated geysers create navigable windows in the hazard that random eruptions would not. A player who understands the pattern can move through the geyser field more safely than one who does not. But the coordination also has a different character than pure gameplay facilitation would require. The pattern is more complex than necessary for the creation of safe windows. The altar at the centre of the Nightmare Frontier's accessible area is one of the most detailed pieces of set dressing in the game and one of the most overlooked. It contains objects that are identifiable with specific healing church iconography, but combined in an arrangement that does not match any known church ritual. The arrangement suggests an improvised or heterodox practice rather than standardized church procedure. Someone was doing something here, using church tools, but not following church protocol. Chapter 15. The Fishing Hamlet, Villages, and the Language of Scales. The Fishing Hamlet's visual design is one of the most distinct in the game. The combination of maritime setting, cult aesthetics, and body horror creates a location that feels isolated from the rest of the game's environments, in a way that reinforces the DLC's narrative of a secret history hidden from the main game story. But the specific design of the Fishing Hamlet villages has properties that reward more attention than the area typically receives. The scales that cover the villages are not uniform. Different villages have different scale coverage and different scale patterns. Some are heavily scaled on the face and arms, others have scaling only on parts of the torso. This variation suggests the scaling is a process rather than a uniform transformation, and that the villages visible in the hamlet are at different stages of a progression rather than at a single endpoint. The most heavily scaled villages are stationary. They stand in specific positions and do not move from those positions. The less heavily scaled villages are the ones that actively patrol and attack. This relationship between scale coverage and mobility is consistent with the scaling representing an advanced state that brings a different kind of existence, one that does not require or permit the same kind of movement that the earlier stages involve. The items that the villagers drop are connected to the sea and to the Great One coast in ways that reinforce the idea that their transformation is a product of long communion with her. The pearl slug item, which comes from the bodies of heavily transformed villagers, has a description that references the sea and the body's adaptation to it. The suggestion is that these people were not simply transformed by the plague, but were undergoing a directed change, becoming something more capable of existing in relationship with Kos. The harpoons used as weapons by some villagers are a practical detail with historical accuracy. Harpoons of the design depicted in the game are consistent with real-world fishing harpoon designs from periods consistent with the game's general aesthetic. This level of historical research in a minor enemy type's weapon design is consistent with From Software's approach to prop design generally, but it is unusual to see it in a location as thematically strange as the Fishing Hamlet, where the accuracy of the harpoon design sits alongside the extreme unreality of the villagers wielding them. The hamlet's building interiors, in the few that are accessible, contain objects that tell stories without commentary. Fishing equipment in states of mid-use, suggesting interrupted work. Personal items arranged in ways that suggest domestic routines. The specificity of these arrangements is greater than the game's level of environmental detail usually requires in optional areas. The sense that this was a functioning community before something happened to it is communicated through these details in a way that the game's pacing never pauses to acknowledge directly. The ritual markings in the hamlet that are associated with Kos worship are concentrated in specific buildings and on specific surfaces. The distribution of these markings is not uniform across the hamlet. Some buildings have them extensively, others have none. The buildings with the most marking concentration are positioned near the water's edge, suggesting the practice was most intense for those closest to the shore, those most in direct contact with whatever presence Kos had in the water. Chapter 16. The Great Ones and what remains of their voices. The Great Ones in Bloodborne are defined by their inaccessibility. They're too large, too strange, and too far beyond human comprehension to be fully engaged with. The game conveys this through visual design, environmental presentation, and the way NPCs who seek communion with them are almost always broken by the experience. But the Great Ones do have voices of a sort, preserved in the Carol runes and in the sounds associated with their presence. Yharnam, the formless Great One, is never seen. The description of Yharnam as formless is not a metaphor. Yharnam does not have a physical form in any state that the game can render. The chapel dedicated to Yharnam in the main game's central Yharnam is a gathering point where people wait for sanctuary, but the entity they are sheltering under the presence of is never visible. The sound effects associated with the Yharnam chapel area have been analysed and include a specific low-register hum that persists throughout the area and is distinct from the ambient urban sounds of Yharnam. This hum has been proposed as Yharnam's voice or breath, the acoustic presence of a being that has no visual presence. The frequency sits below most human speech and above the purely subsonic frequencies used for unease in horror audio design. It is in a range that listeners can hear but often do not consciously register as a specific sound, experiencing it instead as a quality of the space. Ebrietas has a vocalization during her boss fight that has been analysed separately from the fight's music. Her vocalizations are not simply monster sounds. They have a structure that suggests communication rather than simply expression. The sounds change in consistent ways relative to her attack patterns, suggesting each sound type is paired with a specific behavior. Whether this constitutes language in any meaningful sense is a question the game does not answer, but the pairing is deliberate enough to notice. The moon presence has a vocalization that only plays in one specific circumstance, when the true ending is triggered and the moon presence descends to confront the player. It makes a sound as it appears that is not part of its combat audio. This sound plays once and does not repeat. Players who have isolated this sound describe it as being in the same frequency range as the crying in the Murgo fight, though the relationship is again one of suggestion rather than confirmation. Murgo's crying, Ebrietas' structured vocalizations, and the moon presence's arrival sound all exist in adjacent frequency ranges. Whether this reflects a deliberate audio design choice to sonically group the Great Ones together, or whether it is a coincidence of the recording and processing tools used for each sound is genuinely unclear, but the proximity is notable. And in a game where audio design is as deliberate as Bloodborne's, it is worth at minimum registering. The Celestial Emissary, which is the mass of transformed humans seeking to become a Great One, has a vocalization that is the opposite of structured. It is pure noise, a formless wash of sound that combines elements of human voice, animal sound, and synthetic frequency in proportions that change constantly. The formlessness of this sound is consistent with the creature being an aggregate of many individuals who have not yet achieved coherence. The contrast with Ebrietas's apparently structured vocalizations suggests that being a great one involves a kind of sonic coherence that the emissary has not yet reached. Chapter 17. The False Depth Chalice. Dungeons and the rules they break. The False Depth Chalice dungeons are a category of dungeon that exploits the game's glyph system to access content that the standard dungeon generation rules would not normally make available. These dungeons were created by players through careful experimentation with the system's parameters and allow access to enemy combinations, item placements, and room configurations that do not appear in normal dungeon generation. The existence of these dungeons reveals something important about the dungeon generation system's underlying architecture.